From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power.
From Bloomberg's world headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines here in Manhattan as we welcome Friday. Kaylee, it's been a long week with still some races to call and some important breaking news that we're going to bring you through as we set the baseline. Kaylee, Senate races in Nevada and Arizona are keeping us waiting. So is the House of Representatives. But this idea of an early transition for a Trump 2.0 is continuing to take shape.
Yeah, of course, we got the first confirmation of who will be close to the 47th president last night when Trump announced in a statement that Susie Wiles will be his chief of staff, the first ever female White House chief of staff in American history. She, of course, one of the architects of his successful campaign this cycle. And we just got some more news from the Financial Times reporting that Robert Lighthizer, who, of course, was the U.S. trade representative in the first Trump administration, has been asked back to take that job again as he builds out his cabinet. The Financial Times also reporting that Robert O'Brien, who served as the national security advisor during the first Trump admin, will not be returning. But again, according to the FT, Lighthizer will be.
Yeah, reprising his earlier role, having also expressed interest in serving as Treasury Secretary. There are a lot of names around that job. We talked to one of them yesterday in Senator Hagerty, the Republican from Tennessee. Didn't have much to say on that front. But one of the names being considered here on a list that we're going to talk about here with Laura Davison, Bloomberg politics editor, is joining us off the top here from Washington, D.C. with her eyes on the transition. Laura, it's great to see you. We just checked one name off the list here, Lighthizer, second round. What do you think?
So this really suggests that the aggressive trade policy that Trump had in his first term, he's ready to do that plus some. We already know that he wants to do across-the-board tariffs of 10%, perhaps up to 60% from imports from China. So the fact that this is one of the earliest names coming out right after White House chief of staff indicates that this is a top priority for Trump. We know that, day one, day two, day three, he wants to start on this tariff policy. This is something he doesn't need Congress. He doesn't need the agencies. He can do this by executive action. And so we should anticipate to see that, come January 20-something.
Well, so this would be a return act, obviously, Laura. Do we have an understanding of who else from the first Trump admin might be returning for the second go-around, knowing that a lot of people who were close to Donald Trump from 2016 to 2020 are no longer so?
Yeah, and there's a lot of folks who Trump has said, if he had to do it again, and now he, is doing it again, he would not have hired. He's suggested that was one of the mistakes. Folks like Rex Tillerson. There are other people that we may see. Names like Mike Pompeo are back in the mix. Of course, he was Secretary of State and CIA. Other people on the national security front, people like Rick Grinnell may be back in the fold. This is all being worked out. And down at Mar-a-Lago, Trump is taking a bunch of meetings. A bunch of folks are there at Mar-a-Lago, hanging out in Palm Beach, waiting to see if they can get a little bit of FaceTime with the president, Wiles, and, potentially Elon Musk, who's also reportedly down there.
Wow, that's got to be quite a party. You mentioned the former Secretary of State suggesting he might be Secretary of Defense this time around, Secretary Pompeo, and Senator Marco Rubio's name continues to emerge for a potential state role. Does that sound realistic to you, knowing that would create another seat to fill?
Yes, in the Senate, it's much easier. There's a Republican governor, Ron DeSantis, of course. He could appoint, someone to fill Marco Rubio's seat. Someone else who we may see is Doug Burgum, North Dakota governor, who was also a vice presidential contender like Rubio. Where it gets tricky is with these House appointments. There's a bunch of House members, folks like Brian Jack, Elise Stefanik, Mike Walz, who are interested in jobs because we don't know the size of the majority, Republican majority, or if there will be a Republican majority at all. There's a lot of concern that if they pull people from the House to some of these cabinet level jobs, that it means that Republicans either won't have a majority or at least not a big enough one to get through the policy agenda. So folks who are in the House are being told that their candidacy is a little bit on ice right now while that is all being sorted in the House.
We're also getting some more reporting from the Financial Times, Laura, about the potential Commerce Secretary. Apparently, Trump is likely to offer that job to Linda McMahon, who, of course, ran the Small Business Administration during his first admin. So that would be another familiar face, according to the FT. As we consider this transition process, knowing we have heard from both the loser in this presidential race, Vice President Kamala Harris, and President Biden himself yesterday, pledging a peaceful, smooth transition of power, do we have a sense of the extent to which the Trump transition team really wants to be working with the incumbent administration, knowing their skepticism around the General Services Administration, the U.S. intelligence agencies. Could this still be tricky?
Yes, this could be very tricky. And so the public posture, the statements from Trump and his team have been very positive and warm to the president. They've accepted Biden's offer to come to the White House and meet. But behind the scenes, there is concern about, sort of the FBI running some of the background checks. The team hasn't yet, signed on to use federal buildings for the transition. This is all being run out of Mar-a-Lago. They've not yet taken federal government money. So this is, there's still very much a rift between where the Trump team is and, sort of integrating back into the federal government.
It's really fascinating. Should we expect that to change, or is that the way this goes, and simply move everybody into the administration once Joe Biden leaves? And to that end, is there going to be the traditional welcoming of the family on the South Portico? They're going to have breakfast together before the inaugural, or does that just sound like comedy right now?
We'll see how that goes. Biden, at least publicly, has sort of indicated that he wants to have this peaceful transition of power, do everything sort of by the book, and that would be sort of the traditional way of doing it. It's also noteworthy to note that, a lot of the people that Trump wants to bring in may not be able to be confirmed. So this is sort of one of the things that's being discussed. If they can't be confirmed by the Senate or maybe can't pass a background check, what are sort of the ways that Trump could bring these people into special advisor roles in the White House that don't involve sort of the normal government apparatus?
Well, that confirmation will get easier, presumably, with every additional Republican Senate seat in the majority. Laura, obviously, 53 is where we stand right now. It's unclear whether or not that's going to be expanded via Arizona or Nevada. But how much does that matter, that this isn't a 51-49 Senate we're looking at?
It gives Republicans in the Senate a lot more room for error. They can lose some of these more moderate members, Lisa Murkowski, Susan Collins. They don't have to support some of the more controversial or far-right nominees, and they can still pass through. So this gives Trump and his team a lot more leeway of who they can bring forward. They just need a simple majority. And, when you look at the roster of Republican senators, the vast majority are very closely aligned with Trump.
All right, Bloomberg Politics editor Laura Davison, thank you so much. As I alluded to right now, the Senate, as it stands, is 53-45. 53, of course, the size of the Republican majority at this time. The House, though, Joe, remains too close to call. Right now, Republicans have won 211 seats, Democrats 199. There are 25 left to be called, and of course, it takes 218 to have a majority.
This still could go either way. I think favored Republican right now, but as we warned everyone on Tuesday, California is going to end up deciding this. And Kaylee, we just have no idea when that's going to be done.
Yeah, it could take some time still, but we want to get a check-in on sentiment within the Democratic caucus in the House and turn to Florida Congresswoman and former DNC Chair Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who is joining us now here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Congresswoman, thank you so much for your time. Could you just share with us what you're hearing from your leadership in the House, the degree of confidence or not that is being projected?
Kelly and Joe, thank you for having me. And, what we're focused on right now with 25 seats still outstanding in terms of the election result is making sure that every vote is counted. And, we've seen in the past efforts to, try to cast doubt on, the counting process on the West Coast in particular. There are a lot of mail ballots, Washington State, Arizona, Oregon actually conduct all or nearly all of their elections by mail, and California has postmarked by Election Day. So we've got a long 3-day weekend with Veterans Day on Monday. So we have a little bit of time before we're going to know how this plays out. And we have to just make sure that ballots are cured, because people have an opportunity when there's been a mistake that's been made to fix their ballot so that their intention is clear. And so in America, we've got to make sure that we follow the law and make sure that every valid vote has an opportunity to be counted.
Well, I don't want to walk you into too much speculation here, but I do wonder if Democrats take control of the House, and that is going to be the scenario where we have a split Congress and a Donald Trump administration on the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue. What would be the role of what I presume would be a very thin majority, not unlike Republicans have right now? Would it be one of insurgency? Would it be the party of no? What would Democrats consider their role in government to be?
Well, if we do have an opportunity to serve in the majority, as you said, it would be with a slim majority, and that's the situation that the Republicans have now. Regardless, it would be a slim majority either way. We've had a lot of success as Democrats in the minority, with the Republicans only having a 5 and then a 4-seat majority, in being able to make sure that we were the party of normalcy. I mean, they couldn't, because they haven't been able to get out of their own way and even pass legislation with a majority. They've needed Democrats to be able to not shut the government down. They've needed Democrats to be able to not crash the economy into a cliff and by lift the debt ceiling. We've had so many things that have happened as a result of Democrats being team normal because Republicans were team extreme. That will particularly be important with Donald Trump in the White House. And if we have the majority, we're going to need to make sure that we are the backstop to stop mass deportations, to stop him from bringing to a screeching halt all of the progress we've been able to make.
Well, on the subject of Donald Trump, Congresswoman, we are getting some breaking news just crossing the wire here. The U.S. Special Counsel Jack Smith has officially asked the courts to pause the prosecution against Donald Trump. He will announce plans for Trump's case by December 2nd. Keeping in mind here, there were 2 federal cases against Donald Trump, 2 indictments, one in Washington, D.C., related to results of the 2020 election and the attempt to subvert them. Another in your state of Florida, the classified documents case, Congresswoman. Largely, this move from Jack Smith was expected. The DOJ has a policy that says a president of the United States shouldn't be prosecuted. But I do wonder your reaction to this news, keeping in mind already he has become a convicted felon in a state case, but federal is different.
That's right. The 34-count felonies that he's been convicted of, that's a state case, and there's still a sentencing that awaits him. The federal cases, let's remember, include that Donald Trump incited an insurrection on January 6th, and that he egregiously violated the federal law and took home and refused to turn over, as the law requires, vital intelligence documents that he hoarded and that he showed off. So it is essential to our national security that these cases be able to play out. But we do have Supreme Court decisions that established immunity, so those limitations exist, and it's going to have to be sorted out on the federal cases that remain. The state case is, I think, something that we're going to have to keep an eye out on. Certainly, Donald Trump had his day in court, was convicted on all 34 counts by a jury of his peers, and a sentence should hold him accountable.
Congresswoman, should President Biden pardon Donald Trump before he leaves the White House?
I'm not going to be here and tell President Biden what he should do. I personally don't think there should be pardons coming in these cases. These are very, very serious crimes that he's committed. The cases should play out under the rules that the Supreme Court has structured. And so, no, I don't think that President Biden should be pardoning him. President Biden, I know, will be focused on trying to make sure we can continue to finish our agenda strong, continue to bring down the cost of prescription drugs through the continued negotiation after the Inflation Reduction Act successfully brought down the cost of so many prescription drugs. That has to continue. We have to continue to make sure we bring the CHIPS Act implementation forward, because as Speaker Johnson clearly indicated that they were going to look at trying to repeal that. That would be outrageous. We need to make sure that we manufacture computer chips in the United States, continue to create those homegrown jobs. So we have a lot to do while the lame duck session is in session. Well,
and in the remainder of Biden's presidency, Congresswoman, I don't have to tell you that there is within your party a lot of blame being cast on Biden for not stepping away from his reelection campaign sooner. You, of course, used to chair the DNC. We can, I guess, Friday morning quarterback this all we want to. I wonder, though, if you can diagnose what went wrong in this cycle and what the Democrats need to do differently in the midterms in 2026 and then looking forward to 2028.
I've been through a lot of aftermath analyses in post-election losses, and one thing that we need to not do is finger point. The blame game is inappropriate. Look, we have to face some hard realities here. We had tremendous accomplishments under President Biden. We have the strongest economy in the globe post-COVID, but we failed to connect, obviously, with a lot of key constituencies that were previously supportive of Democrats. And we've got some work to do that I know we're going to come together as a family and focus on under Hakeem Jeffries' remarkable leadership, whether he is the minority leader or the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and I still think that's possible. We need to come together with our other Democratic leaders on the leadership team that I'm proud to be a member of and do an analysis. And we have to make sure that we focus on the priorities of the American people, that the diffuse communications system that exists today made it unable for us to penetrate. We have to make sure people know we understand the challenges that they face. When I was on the campaign trail, Kaylee, I still hear from people about the price of groceries. We cannot let grocery companies not pass on savings that they are clearly feeling in the retail at the retail level. And we have to make sure that we're listening to people and responding about the impact of the remaining dregs of inflation that still exist.
Congresswoman Kaylee recalls your time when you chaired the DNC, and we all remember shortly after 2012 the autopsy that the Republican National Committee put forth. It was a 100-page report. Remember, Reince Priebus said we're going to put our cards face up on the table and better appeal to Latino American voters. That was part of the outcome of this election, that in some cases Latinos broke for Trump. And I wonder your thoughts on why. We only have a couple of minutes. I don't want to set you up here for too much of a dissertation, but what would your autopsy say today?
I represent a very large Hispanic constituency in my congressional district, and that outreach is absolutely critical. I wouldn't say that the Republicans under Trump have done such a good job allowing someone to call the island of Puerto Rico a floating island of garbage right before Election Day. Probably wasn't the best way to show that they support Hispanics, but we have to recognize Hispanics are a multi-ethnic population. They can't be treated as one size fits all, and you can only talk to them near an election. And that's something that we have to get to work on, and we have to make sure that we're talking to them about their priorities. The economy, education, healthcare, that's top of the list. And then we also obviously have to deal with immigration challenges and some of the other things that are more uniquely specific to the Hispanic community as well. We're going to do that and more.
Congresswoman, great to have you back. Debbie Wasserman Schultz of Florida, appreciate the conversation and have a great weekend. Kaylee, with breaking news today, this is going to be one of these days with races breaking and news on the transition with more headlines crossing the terminal.
Yeah, again, the special counsel Jack Smith asking the court to pause the prosecution against Donald Trump. Jack Smith, of course, overseeing the 2 federal cases against Donald Trump. The state cases are another matter. As we discussed with the congresswoman, he's already a convicted felon based off of the state case in New York around falsifying business records. But his team is also pushing for the other state case, the racketeering case in Georgia, also related, of course, to the results of the 2020 election, to be tossed as well. So we'll continue to keep track of these developments. Get reaction from our signature political panel, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, right here on Balance of Power, live from New York on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio, live from global headquarters in New York. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lines. The election, of course, is over, but we are still dealing with breaking news as it comes in, pertaining to the outstanding Senate and House races, but also pertaining to the ongoing legal cases, at least for now, against the president-elect Donald Trump. But news breaking just moments ago, Joe, that the special counsel Jack Smith has asked the federal judge overseeing specifically the election interference case against Donald Trump to cancel all upcoming court deadlines in a step toward dropping the case.
Yeah, I guess he'll be making a filing on December 2nd. Kind of an anticlimactic finish, it appears to be, for this massive effort that Jack Smith put together in these 2 cases. And we're joined right now on this breaking news by Bloomberg legal reporter Eric Larson, who's been covering this since the very beginning. Eric, this is how it ends.
Yeah, I mean, we will see what the judge says, but the writing was on the wall as soon as Trump won the election. And just a few days ago, of course, we learned that the Justice Department was already looking into ways to make these 2 cases go away. And, of course, it is a result of this Justice Department, longstanding Justice Department policy that you can't prosecute a sitting president. Of course, Trump is not president yet, but they want to get these cases, I think, out of the way before his inauguration, and this is the first step in doing it.
Well, of course, it's too late for one case against Donald Trump already, Eric. In the falsifying business records case here in New York, he already was convicted on all 34 felony counts, making him a convicted felon. He's supposed to be convicted, or rather sentenced in that case on November 26, just a few weeks from now. Is that still going to happen?
Well, as of right now, that date is still on the books. But you can expect that Trump's lawyers are going to make a strong push to prevent this sentencing from going forward. Of course, he faces as long as 4 years behind bars for these crimes. And even though most legal experts have said that he would probably get far less than that, or even just probation, I don't think they're going to want a judge to be able to issue any kind of sentence at all before the president-elect takes office. So just the mere threat that it could be a sentence of incarceration that would hang over him as he takes office would be the argument that they would make that would interfere with a president's constitutional rights and interfere with his ability to do the important work of office.
All right, Bloomberg's Eric Larson, thank you so much for jumping on the phone with us as we handle this breaking news. Appreciate your time. And of course, there's another case to consider here as well, Joe, another state case, the one brought against him and many other defendants in Georgia.
Absolutely.
Also related to efforts to overturn the 2020 election. That's the racketeering case that the DA of Fulton County, Fani Willis, has brought. It's unclear how that moves forward. The Trump team would like it not to, obviously.
That's for sure. And we have to remember that even if there was a Biden pardon, that doesn't apply to state level cases. So it's an interesting component here to this whole story. Remarkable, though, just within days of this election turnout, we're having this conversation right now. We want to bring in our signature panel, Rick Davis, Stone Court Capital partner, Republican strategist, and Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University and senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Is this how you saw it ending?
Yeah, this is how it should end. I mean, the Justice Department should move forward with dropping these charges. Their long-standing prohibition against prosecuting a president should apply to a president-elect. It is unhealthy for the democracy. And I hope that Alvin Bragg, the DA in Manhattan, is able, or the judges in New York are able to put that to rest as well, because we do have to move forward, and this cannot continue. You cannot do democracy in the courts. It has to be decided at the ballot box. He won, and we have to get behind him and move forward.
Yeah, Rick, could another way of viewing this is the Justice Department abiding by what the will of 74 million Americans is?
Yeah, well, you don't want to just trust 74 million Americans to decide what is legal and what is not legal, right?
Sure.
No one should be above the law, and sitting presidents don't have immunity against their personal acts, right? So just to put it in that context, but it is not healthy for a democracy to be chasing after former presidents or current presidents, you know, for things done not related to their official acts of the presidency. So I think we should have all learned our lesson on this. You know, the indictments of Donald Trump buoyed his campaign in the primary when other people were running against him. And in assuming those things were all done for the right reason, that it was because of the normal course of the legal system, we really did bend the political dynamic here by having all this legal activity around Donald Trump during a presidential year.
I asked Debbie Wasserman Schultz, I'll ask you, should Joe Biden pardon Donald Trump?
No, you know, I don't think so. I would hope
Wouldn't that be good for the sake of the democracy?
You know, I don't think he needs to pardon him. I think the Justice Department does what Jack Smith is asking them to do. And on these state cases, the New York and Georgia, which are very different cases, they move forward as well and ensure that there is no issue involving prison or anything else. And let's put this behind us. I don't think we need to see Joe Biden doing a pardon. And I do think it's a reminder that what Mitch McConnell said during the impeachment and then the trial of that, this should be handled in the courts, was dead wrong. These are political decisions, and he should have stepped up if he thought Donald Trump was guilty, which he said he did, and he should have brought Republicans along to remove him from office at that point, not throw this to the judiciary.
Well, but when we consider the future of the judiciary, obviously Donald Trump, we don't know who it is yet, will be able to appoint his own attorney general. We'll have a new looking Department of Justice, and we should point out consistently during his campaign, Rick, he talked about weaponizing that against his political opponents in the way he felt it had been weaponized against him in all of these cases, this retribution tour. Should we still expect that to happen, or if they go away, does this all move into the quiet?
Oh, we'll never know, right? I mean, I don't think you can predict an outcome on anything in a prospective administration, whether it's Donald Trump's or anybody else's. That being said, I thought Mitt Romney had the right concept 8 months ago, before this campaign really heated up, and said that President Biden should have pardoned him at the time these charges were brought. In other words, why wait till all of this unfolds and all this negativity takes hold in our society when it would have been appropriate for one president to pardon another? This has happened before. The last thing we should be doing is prosecuting for, if there's any shade of political motivation to it, our leaders. And so if you want a healthy democracy, you got to take a step back from this kind of lawfare.
Well, as Donald Trump watches all of this unfold, he's not waiting around to find out. He's going ahead with the transition and reaching out to world leaders. There was a phone call, as we already talked about, with President Zelensky of Ukraine. And there's reporting today, Jeannie, that Elon Musk was also on that call. And of course, the Starlink service has, I guess, something to do with the conversation here about the way forward in Ukraine. But what does that mean for what this administration is going to look like and the role that Musk will play? Because it seems like a pretty big one.
Yeah, I mean, out of Tuesday night, in addition to Donald Trump, the big winner there was Elon Musk. And that is very clear. He was at the speech at Mar-a-Lago on Wednesday morning. He is on the phone with Zelensky, and we assume other world leaders. He has said he will take some kind of role, not necessarily a cabinet position, certainly in the administration. So he has a big role to play. And I think it's going to be the job of the investigative press to be the watchdog. We hope that they are, and to follow what is happening, because this is somebody whose business and life benefits enormously from billions of taxpayer dollars.
So whether or not Elon Musk is in the cabinet remains unclear, but we are getting more reporting on what that cabinet could look like from the Financial Times this hour. Rick, you guessed this last night when we were on Balance of Power. Apparently he's looking at Linda McMahon, the former small business administrator, for Commerce Secretary. Robert O'Brien, who was NSA, or National Security Advisor during the Trump admin, will not be coming back, but coming back for a second round, U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer.
Robert Lighthizer, probably the sharpest protectionist in the Republican Party. And he, as far as Donald Trump was concerned, he did exactly the right thing in his first term, organizing the tariff regime against China and others. So we can expect a lot of that to happen again. Look, I think one of the things we're going to be surprised about is that there aren't going to be that many big surprises, around Donald Trump's selection of people for his cabinet or his sub-cabinet. It's a trust relationship there, and these are all talented people. I mean, Linda McMahon, really did a fabulous job at the Small Business Administration, especially as COVID started to take a hold. So I think we can anticipate a professional cabinet, but one that is intensely loyal. And so, and look, I mean, I think the jury's out right now. We don't know what role Elon Musk is going to take, but Elon Musk has reformed the space program, satellite program, infrastructure development. I mean, we could do worse than to have someone like him sitting next to the president when he's making decisions. That being said, we'll see where he winds up if there is an official position for him.
As a former lawyer for the U.S. steel industry, which kind of gives us an interesting backdrop for the Nippon proposed acquisition of U.S. Steel, which obviously Donald Trump doesn't want to see happen. But what does this appointment, he hasn't accepted it yet, suggest about Trump 2.0?
I think Trump 2.0 in this way, I think, is not going to be like, unlike Trump 1.0. He didn't have much use for the cabinet beyond some critical positions. He left a lot of that to his folks, and his number one demand was loyalty and assisting him in fulfilling his promises. So I think that's what we are seeing here. And I think, what we're hearing also is that those people who cannot make it through Senate confirmation, and there are some, are going to be put into the White House as officials. So I think we're going to see a movement of officials who can get through confirmation, going that route to the cabinet, All of the other ones, and we know their names, are going to be put in the White House regardless. And I do think on Elon Musk, we have a system of checks and balances. We do not anoint somebody to fix infrastructure and everything else without those checks. So he is brilliant and he does a lot, but he also needs to be checked.
We know their names. Steve Bannon. Who are you talking about?
Oh, well, we know their names, right? Steve Bannon, you can think about, I mean, we can think of a whole host of people. We know some of those people. You know, when you think just about Stephen Miller on the issue of, you know, trying to, for instance, work on his #1 promise, which is deportation. That is Stephen Miller's game. He won't make it through a Senate confirmation, but he'll do it once again from the White House.
Well, it'll get easier with every additional senator in the Republican majority, right, Rick? There's still 2 races outstanding.
Still 2 races outstanding. I think we're at 53. Yeah, I mean, I don't think additional races will matter other than, you know, comfort going forward when you need to get a cloture vote for 60. So the real question is for fiscal issues, whether or not Republican majority will hold in the House. I think we're going to be waiting around until California counts all their ballots. So that could be weeks before we actually know the content of Congress.
How about Arizona? You've got people on the ground there. When are we going to get a call?
For the Senate race,
yeah.
I think very soon. There are 45,000 votes still uncounted. Most of those are in Maricopa County.
Right.
And the way Maricopa County releases things, it's in the order of which they came in. So last night, for instance, we got a release from people who dropped off ballots on Election Day. They didn't vote on Election Day by walking in and casting a vote. They voted by just turning in their ballot like they mailed it that same day. So those were counted and, you know, Republicans picked up a little bit. So we'll see.
Maybe we'll find out while we're in the late edition of Balance of Power. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, thank you so much. Coming up, we have much more ahead from World Headquarters in New York as the second Trump administration begins to take shape. Alongside Kaylee Lines, I'm Joe Matthew on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. We're live at World Headquarters in New York. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines. You made it to Friday. Welcome to the threshold of the weekend following quite a week in the history of politics, and Kaylee, the markets as well. I have officially lost count of the record highs on the S&P 500, but it looks like we have another one today.
Yeah, I mean, we're closing in on the 6,000 level.
Something
if Donald
else.
Trump were already president, we might be making some hats at this point, or at least when it comes to
Somebody
the Dow,
is.
which is encroaching on 44,000 here. So let's get a check of these financial markets with Bloomberg Markets correspondent Abigail Doolittle. So, Abigail, we just keep climbing.
It is pretty impressive, this rally that we have. And in fact, relative to those record highs, we are at another record high. In fact, the 50th of the year. A lot of this, of course, having to do with this week's stunning events with President-elect Donald Trump winning the U.S. presidency. Investors love it, that Trump trade in full effect. Now, it started to come into effect back in September, frankly, but this week we're looking at the best week in more than a year, up 4.7% for the S&P 500. The idea that tax cuts and other protectionist behaviors, policies out of the Trump administration could help the economy and therefore stocks. But the Russell 2000, that small cap index, those domestically based companies really outperforming, signaling that Trump trade, up more than 8% or 7% on the week, the best week going back to 2021. It's not just the Russell 2000, though. Bitcoin surging by about 10%. And then, of course, DJT higher at one point on the week. It's been flipping. Interestingly enough, Tesla higher significantly on the week, up more than 10%. So Donald Trump's biggest supporter, Elon Musk, really benefiting. And then, Joe, I know you love that VIX. That VIX at a 14 handle. Last week, it was at a 22 handle. The fears that we've had, well, they have certainly gone away. Investors excited for what this new administration could bring, again, to the economy and the markets.
All right. Abigail Doolittle, thank you so much for all the help this week, keeping tabs on the markets for us as we cover politics here from our desk. Notable Wall Street names, as we've been discussing, are expected to have a bigger role in Washington next year. Former hedge fund CEO, now U.S. Senator-elect David McCormick told us back in June about his plans for public office and fighting high prices.
We've got to get inflation under control, but the drivers of inflation are bad energy policy that have driven up the prices of fuel and too much spending. And so I would say reversing certainly some of those Biden spending bills and rolling back the war on natural gas and fossil fuels is the key to getting our economy back in check. And I wouldn't, particularly now when so many families are burdened buy this inflation, I wouldn't burden them further by rolling back the tax cuts that President Trump put in place.
Bloomberg's Sonali Basak was part of that interview and has interviewed Howard Lutnick and others in the past year. Joins us right now at the table. It's great to see you. Our worlds are truly colliding here, aren't they?
They certainly are, because there are a lot of business names, aren't there? Yeah. Especially when you're thinking about the Trump transition and who could be in office next.
So talk some names here, because this is your Rolodex. Apparently, is going to be populating the White House, some of the agencies, and also having the ear of the president. There are a couple of different levels here that they could influence policy in this next administration.
Well, we already talked about Howard Lutnick, of course, being a very close part of this transition, but also this new news about Robert Lighthizer and trade is significant because it opens the door more on who might be chosen for Treasury Secretary. I am going to cite the election betting odds, because not only have they been right before, they actually also have now Scott Bessent, longtime hedge fund manager, formerly at Soros, now at Key Square, in the lead on that. That is someone we're watching very, very closely. John Paulson as well is high up on the odds, not as high up as Scott Bessent. But the thing to consider here is y'all have been talking a lot about the Fed as well, right? Scott Bessent is one of the people that put forward the idea of a shadow Fed president and how likely that might be. That's something that still has not been addressed. And so there's a lot of scuttle about the people themselves and what it would mean. As it pertains to Lighthizer, one other important aspect of this is the protectionist policies that could come with him. And the idea of what mergers may or may not get through. U.S. Steel, for example, is something that a lot of bankers have had their eye on, a lot of investors have had their eye on. Prominent banker this morning telling us you could just look at where U.S. Steel is trading and it tells you what they think will happen of this deal. For those folks on Wall Street, very excited about a return of a lot of financial activity, mergers and acquisitions. There is a role protectionism would play here to thwart some of that, particularly when you have foreign investment coming into the U.S. and buying U.S. assets.
As our Bloomberg television audience sees some photos here of people who could potentially be Treasury Secretary, we actually spoke to one of them on Balance of Power last night, Senator Bill Hagerty of Tennessee. We asked him specifically, Sonali, about the comments made by Fed Chair Jay Powell in the news conference yesterday when he was asked whether he would resign if Trump asked him to. The answer to that was no. Also asked, though, about the legality of demoting at will any Fed governor or vice chair, like, say, Michael Barr. And Hagerty said, yeah, we should test that legal theory. He does not like Michael Barr, or maybe more specifically, the Basel III endgame Barr initially put forward.
I'm glad you brought that up, because even when you look outside of the Fed and the Fed supervision role here, very, very important, because Basel III is one critical piece of the pie here, but then you brought in the net and think about the SEC, the CFTC, the FTC. I spoke to Rina Agarwal in just really an hour or so ago over at Georgetown. She was part of the Biden-Harris transition. She said it's a very common for that SEC chair, CFTC chair, to step down quite swiftly. So a lot of people are now watching not just these initial cabinet posts, but how quickly you're going to see those names for SEC and CFTC come up. Because remember, the SEC wasn't just tough on crypto. They were very, very tough on the banks and the hedge funds. There were billions of dollars worth of fines levied in the last couple of years for things like texting outside of the traditional email channels on WhatsApp and other threads. So a lot of expectation for a full-scale wind back of some of the rules and enforcement actions being taken.
You mentioned quickly Scott Bessent and the idea of a shadow Fed chair. We talked to him about that on the program, gosh, I don't know how many weeks ago at this point. Jay Powell yesterday was asked if he would leave the building if he was told to resign, and he said no. Is the idea here to just turn him into an instant lame duck?
Well, that's not how the shadow Fed part would work, right? He could stay in that spot and still have a shadow Fed.
But also not have the influence potentially with this person sitting right behind him.
That's the biggest problem, and that's where a lot of clarity is needed. There are a lot of people, Stan Druckenmiller included, that say that, and Scott Bessent worked for Stan Druckenmiller, that's why that was relevant, that say that that would erode the credibility of the Fed in a very significant way and how the markets read the Fed. The idea there is Powell would stay where he is. You put somebody else in who would then become the Fed chair in the next term, but he would that next person would undermine Powell at every turn. The markets would be confused, wouldn't it? And I think something very important to consider here is the role the Fed has been playing as a backstop to markets. even if in the next couple of months you see the bond markets misbehave, underpinning this market, you have a lot of people who are very worried about overnight rates, even at this juncture, as you still have Treasury issuance as heavy as it is.
Yep.
It's a tough calculus to not have that kind of confidence from a market perspective at this point of time. And the answer to your point is not clear on whether Trump would try to seek to put a shadow Fed official there.
Yeah. All right, Bloomberg, Sonali Basak, thank you so much. We're, of course, going to stay in very close contact with Sonali as we follow this transition and the economic and Wall Street players that could be involved in it. Now, as I mentioned, we did speak to one name that's being floated out there, Senator Bill Hagerty, last night on Balance of Power about Michael Barr and Basel III. Listen in his words to what he told us.
This Basel III endgame, this is, in my view, a rogue operation that has put a great deal of uncertainty to the marketplace. I'm glad that I've seen the banking community stand up against this. I certainly think that Basel III has been, all the proposals that I've seen have been largely bad for the American economy because they make us less competitive as a nation.
Joining us now from our Washington, D.C. bureau is someone who's been chatting Basel III with us for a long, long time now. Nathan Dean, senior U.S. policy analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence. So, Nathan, for all of the talk about it, is it now dead in the water? What realistically is going to happen once this admin moves in?
Yeah, so I don't think it's dead, but it's certainly delayed for a year, if not longer, because, while the Fed and Michael Barr, the vice chairman, are going to stay there for some time, the OCC and the FDIC will most likely flip. And if you don't have all three together, then you don't have a rule. So I think when the Trump administration comes in and the new regulatory leadership takes place, I think they're going to say, you know what, we're not going to move forward with Basel III. We're just going to sit and wait. Now, there is some thought here that potentially would finalize it in 2026 or 2027, just because the Europeans have already finalized their version. It's called Basel IV. But we just think it's a wait-and-see moment. But we don't think that 9% capital increase for those big banks are going to happen anytime soon.
Put the Basel III T-shirts on hold, Nathan. We've been watching bank shares rally, and I'm sure your phone has been ringing as we remind our listeners and viewers that from your perch at Bloomberg Intelligence, you're the one who actually has some experience on the front line with terminal users, the questions and concerns that they have going into another administration here. What will it mean for mergers and acquisitions, the animal spirits we keep hearing about since Tuesday night?
Yeah, so, we obviously saw a positive reaction from Capital One and Discover because they have, I think, the biggest merger that a lot of people are looking at the moment. And, our view is that the Fed was going to take a positive look at it under the Biden/Harris administration. And we also think the Fed's going to take a positive look at it. And I think the real opportunity for the Trump administration here is that a lot of the DOJ risk is beginning to decrease for that merger. And so maybe the speed of mergers will certainly increase. And I think a lot of the questions that have been asked in a Democratic administration won't be asked in a Republican administration. And, the other thing, just going to the prior point about Michael Barr and whether or not you demote him or not, there's a lot of optimism in the markets about this deregulation effort amongst banks. But if Michael Barr stays at the Fed in his role until 2026, it's going to take the Trump-era regulators years, potentially not even enough time in a first administration to get all these deregulatory efforts through. You still have to follow a comment period and a rule process. So I think that's what's driving a lot of this question of will President Trump demote Michael Barr and try and speed up that deregulatory effort.
Well, and he wants that deregulation effort to go well beyond the banking sector. We could apply it to energy as well. That's part of what drill, baby, drill means, is make it a lot easier to build out that infrastructure and start that actual leasing and permitting process. And that's, of course, a doubling down, Nathan, on oil and gas in the U.S., less so on cleaner energies, as he's talking about peeling back a lot of the subsidies from the Inflation Reduction Act, including for EVs. How easy is that repeal actually going to be, though?
Yeah, so this is where you have to figure out which regulation goes into which bucket. Is it legislation, regulation, or executive order? Something like the LNG pause, that's executive order. President Trump can do that fairly quickly. The IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, that's legislation. And so the bulk of that, in terms of the EV tax credits, that's going to have to go through Congress. Now, look, it looks like the Republicans are going to take the House. They've already taken the Senate. So if they use reconciliation for tax reform, there's a lot in the IRA that they can play around with. But we have heard, and this is what we're telling our clients, is that the IRA is somewhat popular in Republican states. There's a lot of CapEx coming into those states in terms of building new plants in the renewable sector. So certainly the EV tax credit, I think, is at risk. But a lot of the IRA, we do think, is going to stick around.
You wonder if Elon Musk would talk to him about that. I want to ask you about the CHIPS Act. Nathan, because there appears to be an eagerness to undo or unwind portions of the bill, if not get rid of it altogether. But it actually seems to align more with the Trump philosophy when you consider reshoring, bringing jobs here, lowering our dependence upon Taiwan. Doesn't that sound like a favorable Trump plan?
Yeah, I think when they get into the nitty-gritty of their legislative priorities, I don't think they're going to touch the CHIPS Act all that much. One thing, a lot of it's already been spent. I think somewhere like 85, 90% of the monies have already been doled out. I think certainly any unclaimed monies and untaxed, tax incentives, they can certainly claw back. But I wouldn't be surprised if they were to try and tackle, they being the Republicans, would try and tackle some of the social elements of the CHIPS Act, maybe like environmental or labor requirements that go along with accepting this type of incentive. But we're telling our clients that largely we think the CHIPS Act is okay just because of the bipartisan nature it passed through Congress. It doesn't go through reconciliation like the Inflation Reduction Act would. And so we do think that the bulk of the CHIPS Act should be secure and something that's very important to those chip makers.
Finally, Nathan, obviously a lot of what underpinned the promises made by Donald Trump on the campaign trail, and a lot of them were tax related. How quickly do we expect a tax package could come together in the next Congress and then get over the finish line? Keeping in mind, in 2017, it was passed in 2017, the very same year that Trump took office.
Yeah, it's certainly going to happen before January 1st, 2025, because that's when those individual tax cuts increase. Now, we saw from Representative Scalise earlier this week that they want to move on this within the first 100 days of President Trump's presidency. But I will caution that it's going to cost plus of $4 trillion to keep those tax cuts going. And not many people in Washington really have any good ideas. There's a lot of square pegs going into round holes at the moment. So I would caution, I think it's going to take Congress a little bit of time to figure out how they're going to pay for it. There's maybe talk about putting tariffs in there, the SALT deduction, and so forth like that. So I think that we'll probably see it before the summertime. It just may not be within the first 100 days.
Nathan Dean, Bloomberg Intelligence. Thank you so much, Nathan. I know you're about to embark on a long journey to talk to more terminal subscribers. We wish you safe travels. Coming up, hour 2, Balance of Power, we'll be joined by Rohit Kumar, the former Deputy Chief of Staff to Senator Mitch McConnell, as we follow the bead here on the transition, not only the administration, but what's going to be coming next, the balance of power in Congress. Our conversation ahead with Jonathan Tamari as well from Bloomberg Government as we anticipate a possible recount in Pennsylvania. The Senate race there. We'll have a lot more coming up on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power.
From Bloomberg's world headquarters in New York City to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons. We are so close to the end of election week, and while we know who will be the 47th president of the United States, Donald Trump, and know there will be a Republican majority in the Senate, we do not know on this Friday, as of 1 p.m. Eastern time, how large that majority will be. Right. It'll at least be 53, and we still don't know who will control the House of Representatives, with still over 24 races left to be called.
Yeah, we could go into next week not knowing. We do know, however, that Donald Trump is likely to be having less to worry about in the legal department, with news breaking in our first hour. This is just past noontime Eastern. We learned special counsel Jack Smith is asking the federal judge overseeing the election interference case against Donald Trump to cancel all upcoming court deadlines. We're going to get a filing from Jack Smith the 2nd of December, Kaylee, that could bring an end to both of these cases.
Yeah, of course, there's still questions around the 2 state cases against the president-elect. He is set to be sentenced in New York, at least for now, on those 34 felony counts of falsifying business records on November 26th. Unclear if that will change, and unclear what the future is of the prosecution against him in the state of Georgia in the racketeering case.
That's right. And we'll, of course, keep tabs on all of these for you, with votes still being counted. To Kaylee's point, we're still waiting for some big races outstanding here to be called, specifically in the Senate as well. You mentioned the House, but we still need calls in Nevada and Arizona before we can zip those up. And there are a lot of questions about what's going on and what might come next in Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
Kaylee, this is fascinating to think that Senator Casey is likely headed for a recount here after the race was called for David McCormick. Puts a big question mark over the swing state of Pennsylvania. Joining us now as an expert on Pennsylvania, Bloomberg Government Congress reporter Jonathan Tamari. It's great to have you, Jonathan. Is a recount assured?
Just about. There right now, Senator Casey is about a 0.5 percentage point behind David McCormick, the Republican, and that is within the number for a mandatory recount. So Senator Casey will have to request it, but it will be granted as long as the count stays within that number, and we'll see if there are enough votes to be picked up to make up the gap there.
Well, and of course, assuming that the gap is not made up, if these results largely stand even in a recount, it will be part of that 53 Senate majority at least. Jonathan, we don't know yet about Nevada and Arizona. The Democrats are both ahead there by narrow margins. What difference would a 53-45 Senate make relative to a 54-44 Senate?
I mean, it could be a really significant difference. All you have to do is think back to the first Trump administration when they were trying to pass the Affordable Care Act repeal, and a few handful of votes, just derailed one of Republicans' biggest policy promises of the last decade. And so you have two moderates in particular, Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, who sometimes break with their party on some of the more far-reaching things that they push. And, the difference is if there's 53 and they break, all it takes is one other defection, and that prevents Republicans from getting what they want, or maybe two if they have the vice presidency. So two additional defections. If they have 54 seats, that's just that much more margin for error on nominations and on anything they try on reconciliation, which will be the main vehicle for legislation early in the Trump administration.
We've been watching headlines drop on the name game here as Donald Trump moves to fill out his cabinet. We just got another from the Financial Times, and not a surprise, Donald Trump eyeing Doug Burgum as a new energy czar. I don't know if we're talking about running the energy department or not, but we could have more to come here. What are you seeing?
Well, according to the Financial Times reporting, the energy czar role would likely replace the climate czar or national climate advisor established by the Biden White House, according to the FT. Exactly.
Fascinating. This also comes alongside a headline from Politico here, Jonathan, that's hits closer to home in Congress where you spend your days. Senator Tim Scott, who of course was a presidential candidate, is now moving to launch a bid to take over as chair of the NRSC for the 2026 cycle. That might tell us the extent to which he would be, or not in this case, involved in a Trump administration. Why is he going here? It's a far cry from being president.
It is, but it's a pretty significant position within Congress. It's a strong stepping stone. The current chair of the NRSC, Steve Daines, has gained a lot of clout based on Republicans' strong performance this year in Senate races. So it's a way to move up the ranks within leadership in Congress. If Tim Scott has run for president, that option is still open to him. But if he wants to become a Senate leader, this is a really good way to do it. You connect with fundraisers all across the country. You connect with candidates all across the country. You visit all their districts, their states. So it's a good way both to build your profile within Congress and nationally for whatever he wants to do down the line.
Could he, Jonathan, be both the chair of the NRSC and also still chair the Senate Banking Committee?
That I'm not sure of. I believe you can, because the NRSC is more of a political position, but Republicans may have limits on what type of how many leadership positions you have to hold. So I would actually have to check on that to be sure, to be honest with you.
What are you hearing from leadership meetings that were held yesterday on both sides? Jonathan, they're both waiting for news, but also trying to position themselves for whatever the next session is going to bring. What are you hearing from leadership?
Yeah, I mean, the big question on leadership is actually among Senate Republicans, who's going to be leading this new majority. And that's going to all unfold next week. As you know, Mitch McConnell is stepping down as the Republican leader. And so it'll be the first time in almost 20 years Republicans are choosing a new leader there. And you've got John Thune and John Cornyn, two very veteran senators who are considered the favorites. But Rick Scott out of Florida is someone to keep an eye on. He's kind of considered more of a Trump-like figure, more close with Trump potentially. And given the momentum that Trump is going to have coming into the presidency, given the momentum behind the MAGA movement after the showing they had Tuesday night, it's worth keeping an eye on Scott in that race as well. The Republicans are going to vote, Senate Republicans are going to vote on Wednesday to pick their next leader.
course, we have questions about House leadership as well, which may depend on whether or not Republicans retain the majority. If they do, everyone in House leadership currently could keep their spot. But there is a question, Jonathan, about how difficult it might be to pull from the House for any positions in a Trump administration if it is a narrow majority they're looking at. Right now, it's 211, 199 Republicans to Democrats, 25 yet to be called. 218 makes a majority. If it's in that 218 and maybe just a few extra range, can Donald Trump really afford to take any one individual Republican out of the mix?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really big question. It might depend on the individual laws in that state. You know, some states fill their vacancies faster than others. So it's certainly something they're going to have to consider, and will probably depend on how much the president values that individual member and their insight. So I think it'll depend on the state and the district that they come from as well. If it's a competitive district, you might not want to remove an incumbent. If it's a really safe district that can get filled quickly, maybe you take that chance for a little while.
All right, Bloomberg Government Congress reporter Jonathan Tamari, thank you so much. Now, as we discussed with Jonathan, obviously there is a Pennsylvania Senate race that has been called for Dave McCormick, but is likely to go to a recount. We still have two outstanding that have not been called, one being in Arizona, which hasn't been called at the presidential level, I would add, though Donald Trump obviously is leading it at this stage in the count, and it ultimately won't matter for Electoral College purposes. But in the Senate race, it's actually a bit tighter than many people anticipated. Ruben Gallego, the Democratic candidate, only up right now by 1.5 percentage points on the Republican candidate, Kari Lake, with 77% of the votes counted.
It'll be very interesting to see what the next drop from Maricopa County brings and whether this race is called over the weekend. We knew Arizona would take a long time, but this is one of the last two.
So let's go to an expert on Arizona politics now. Joining us is Samara Klar. She is professor of political science at the University of Arizona. She's also co-author of the book Partisan, Hostility, and American Democracy, Explaining Political Division. Samara, thanks for coming back to Bloomberg TV and radio. Last we spoke was in the wee hours in the aftermath of the election on Wednesday morning. When we look at this Senate race, this tight margin between Gallego and Lake, knowing Gallego was pretty consistently with a healthy lead on Lake in the polls, what are you thinking here? Is there a chance Lake pulls this out?
I mean, there's a chance. It hasn't been called. Gallego's maintained his lead throughout the count, and we still, I think we're now at 78%, 79% reporting. He's up by 1.5 points. Anything could happen. That's why it hasn't been called. They won't call it till they know for sure. It looks as though he's still obviously outperforming Harris, who is more significantly behind Donald Trump. That, as you mentioned, hasn't been called either, but is sure to be called for Trump. Now, we knew there was a percentage of Trump voters who were going to be voting for Gallego. It looks as though that did happen. The question is, how many of those Trump voters stuck with that decision and decided to vote for Gallego? How many of them maybe decided to not vote in the Senate at all? But we won't know until this thing is all done.
Well, based on where we are in the count here, is there still a path for Kari Lake to win?
For last I checked, it's about 1.5 points, and there's about 20% votes coming in. It's possible. If it weren't possible, they would have called it already. I think that it looks unlikely. I mean, it looks as though Gallego will most likely hold on to the lead, but we don't know. I mean, Arizona is a state where candidates win by incredibly tiny margins. I mean, in our House race right now, I believe Christian Engel is ahead of Siscomani by just a couple hundred votes. So this is the Arizona way. Every single ballot has to be counted before we know for sure.
That's the Arizona way. What about the Kari Lake way, Samara? We all remember her failed gubernatorial bid in which she never actually accepted that she lost the race. How would we expect it to go down if indeed this is ultimately called for Gallego? Would the story necessarily end there based off of what we've experienced in the past?
Well, listen, we know that Kari Lake did not accept that defeat in 2022 against Katie Hobbs. I think things are a little different now in that Trump has won, and he probably doesn't want to be part of the election is rigged narrative that doesn't really benefit him. And I think there probably is a lot less of an appetite for it among Republican voters in Arizona generally. I think the momentum towards this election denialism has certainly calmed a bit in Arizona. And Trump being the victor is kind of going to seal the deal on that. I don't think Trump wants to discuss rigged elections or fake elections. He's won. He's happy with it. And I don't think Kari Lake's going to have a lot of support if she starts sharing conspiracy theories about election denialism again.
There was a lot of reporting, Samara, and Bloomberg did quite a bit of reporting as well on the hardening of polling locations the drone coverage, snipers on roofs, the extent to which Arizona went to create some confidence around the system here and also protect the vote from poll watchers or other bad actors potentially. How did Arizona do? Because there were no reports of trouble that I saw.
That's right. I mean, Arizona and the election officials here worked really overtime to try to ensure that there was absolutely no doubt that our elections were being conducted fairly, that everybody was going to feel secure. I was doing polling on Arizona where I asked voters, do you believe that elections in Arizona are safe and trustworthy? The overwhelming majority of Democrats believed they were. Republicans were split about 50-50. We had about half of Republicans saying, yes, I have confidence in our elections, half of Republicans saying no. Those without confidence in the elections were significantly more likely to vote for Donald Trump, as it happens, as it probably is in part due to some of the messaging he shared since 2020. But ultimately, we've heard of, no funny business going on with our elections. And hopefully, once this is all said and done, people will be able to move on.
Well, Samara, as we discussed with you the morning after the election, Arizona also had abortion on the ballot in this cycle. Abortion rights were protected at the same time that it looks like Donald Trump will have the state called for him at some point. And I wonder if we can treat Arizona as a microcosm for the way all of this played out on the national level, which is that abortion is not quite the mobilizing issue that Democrats were necessarily counting on, that maybe issues like the immigration issue, obviously hyper relevant in a border state like Arizona, are much more significant.
Sure. Well, I'd say probably the most significant issue for voters in Arizona was the economy. They were repeatedly saying that that was the issue most important to them. Latino voters, non-Latino voters, men and women. The economy was really number one for voters. I don't know if we can necessarily say that having abortion on the ballot didn't help Harris. It may have actually helped Harris. We don't know this counterfactual world where abortion wasn't on the ballot. It's possible she may have done worse without it. But having abortion on the ballot certainly did allow pro-choice Republicans the option of supporting their preferred candidate, Donald Trump, and supporting reproductive rights. And we do know that, in the polling that I've been doing, over a third of Republicans were planning on voting in favor of this measure. So from that perspective, having it on the ballot kind of gives Trump an out. People can both vote for Republicans, can vote for Trump, and can support abortion separately.
Interesting. The so-called single voter when it comes to the issue of abortion is something we talked about a lot. How about the single issue voter when it comes to the border? To what extent did they play into this result in Arizona?
Yeah, the border was a huge issue in Arizona. And similarly to abortion, we had a big ballot measure that gives the Arizona state law enforcement the power to both arrest and deport immigrants who cross into Arizona unlawfully. So that's a really, really conservative border policy. There's a good chance that may never make it into law. It probably has quite a bit of a legal battle ahead of it. That ballot measure passed overwhelmingly. A significant portion of Democrats supported that. So we saw both Republicans voting in favor of abortion rights and Democrats voting in favor of this really punitive border policy. So you can see how voters here in Arizona were taking these issues pretty seriously and considering them separate from the presidential race.
Well, but when we consider the presidential race of the future, look ahead to 2028, what lesson needs to be learned for the Democratic Party that they need to do differently the next go around to be able to win the state of Arizona? Is it going to have to be a border hawk at the top of the ticket?
Well, I think we've got months, if not years, of speculation over, what did or did not go wrong for the Democrats or in this election. I will say that, Donald Trump currently looks like he's winning Arizona by about 4 percentage points. That would still put him at probably one of the lowest margins of victory ever for a Republican candidate in Arizona who still wins the state. He set that record already in 2016. So we're not seeing overwhelming support for Donald Trump in Arizona. We do have an electorate here that is, has significantly more Republicans than Democrats. Our registration numbers show about a 6 percentage point advantage for Republicans and about a third who identify as independents. So a 4 percentage point win for Trump in Arizona is still a fairly narrow margin, especially in a state with more Republicans than that. Now, obviously, what the Democrats were hoping for was a win. The fact of the matter is Democrats rarely win in presidential elections in Arizona. We did it once in the 90s. We did it once in 2020. But Arizonans, we typically vote for Republicans at the presidential race. And I don't know if we can take this win by Trump and say that the Democrats have lost Arizona. I think it's still in this long-term trend away from being a heavily Republican state, more toward a purple state.
Well, Professor, I know that your specialty covers more than just Arizona, and I wonder, just broadly speaking, about the results this week, save a few of the races that have yet to be called. Your thoughts on the comment from Bernie Sanders that the Democratic Party abandoned the working class and therefore the working class abandoned the Democratic Party? Nancy Pelosi is speaking to the New York Times today, condemning those remarks, saying Bernie Sanders has not won. And I have a great deal of respect for him, but says she does not respect him saying the Democratic Party has abandoned working class families. Was that part of the narrative?
Well, again, I think it's going to be months of speculation here. What did the Democrats do right or wrong? We know that there has been, a global trend since 2022 of incumbent parties losing their elections. The United States is now part of that. We know that we've had high levels of inflation since COVID. The Biden White House was going to have a hard time getting a second term, and Harris was seen as part of that administration. So, I don't know if I'm ready, or anyone should be at this point, to pinpoint one specific thing that went wrong. I think Bernie Sanders is correct in suggesting that the economy was the number one issue. And if the Democrats were to win, they really had to connect with voters on how they were going to improve their financial lives.
Always a great conversation with University of Arizona political science professor Samara Klar. Professor, thank you so much for the insights. It's great to have you with us. We'll have our panel together next, Kaylee, and a lot to talk about with Rick Davis and Jeannie Sheehan Zaino. There's quite a bit of news is broken here, including the news about Jack Smith.
Yep.
Looks like the two trials he was pursuing, the two cases against Donald Trump, are coming to an end.
At least that's what the Department of Justice would like, to continue abiding by their longstanding policy of not prosecuting U.S. presidents while they're in office. We'll see if the judge cooperates with that, Joe.
Right.
And just reminds us, we still have much more news to go, even as we wrap up this election week here. Live from New York on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kaylee Lyons alongside Joe Matthew, live from World Headquarters in New York as we close out our week of coverage from headquarters, Joe, and get ready to head back to Washington now that this week of the presidential election is about to wrap up, though we do still have a few outstanding questions. The balance of the House, certainly. The rest of the Senate majority, or the size of it, rather, as we wait for the news of two more Senate races, but also the architecture of the Trump cabinet. We're getting more ideas of who might actually end up in this administration that will take the helm, of course, in January. Yeah,
that's right. Robert Lighthizer, as we've been talking about, U.S. Trade Representative, could be reprising his role. He hasn't actually accepted that job, according to the Financial Times, but there have been a couple of others here, and they're familiar names, remembering who was on the campaign trail. Doug Burgum, also apparently being pursued as an energy czar. Kaylee, to your point, not an energy secretary. Think of John Kerry's job with the Biden administration, and it would be the Trump 2.0 version.
Well, yeah, I guess that's true, although it's going to look basically exactly the opposite. What was climate goes back perhaps to traditional oil and gas. So let's get into all of this now and welcome back our signature political panel. Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital and Republican strategist, alongside Jeannie Sheehan Zaino, political science professor at Iona University and senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. So as we consider this cast of characters that we've already come to learn a bit more about, a lot of people that are not too surprising, and I know, Rick, in the last hour you suggested we won't have a lot of surprises necessarily when it comes to the Trump cabinet. But what is going to be the hardest decision for Donald Trump and those close to him, including his named chief of staff, Susie Wiles, to decide? What role is it that might have the most debate and take the longest for us to find out who's going to fill it?
Well, I think that you look at the major cabinet positions, right? State, Treasury, defense. And you really wonder, those are the big building blocks of any administration, right? And the model in the past, when Donald Trump was first elected in 2016, was to get, people who had a lot of gravitas and experience, and none of them were there at the end of that first term, right? They'd all been replaced at least once, in some cases, multiple times. Although Mnuchin at Treasury survived the entire time. So I think that he'll draw upon that experience. I think you'll find that being a creature of Wall Street to some degree, he'll be deferential to wanting someone who has that experience in the past, because it served him very well, in his first administration. But at state and defense, he did not have a good track record. And I would think that he was going to get real loyalists in there rather than, people who might have, independently established themselves in those fields.
Some of these names being attached to various agencies, Linda McMahon at Commerce, makes you wonder how Elon Musk will interact with all of them. They'll have their own interests in their own agencies as he attempts to cut trillions from government spending. How's it going to work?
Yeah, and of course, he has the president's ear. Of course, Linda McMahon as well has a very close relationship with the president. But, I think Elon Musk is more likely to work through the president and with the president. And he is. It's not easy. We've seen this movie over and over again where somebody comes in and says, I'm going to cut the size and scope and spending of the federal government. Sure. Now, we haven't had an Elon Musk, and he has been incredibly successful in all aspects of his professional life. So that may make this different. But the reality is that attempt to decrease the size of this federal government is a fraught endeavor. And he is going to have to, let's not forget, work with the House to do that. He can't simply go in and cut the way he might at Twitter or X. He's going to have to work through the House. The House is likely to be Republican, but narrowly so. So it is going to be a lot different experience for somebody like Elon Musk than he has had in his other aspecents of his professional life.
Well, I'm glad you said the phrase narrowly so, keeping in mind we don't know ultimately if Republicans will retain the majority in the House, but it hasn't been extremely easy for them to deal with that majority during this Congress over the last 2 years, Jeannie, because it has been so tight. We've seen multiple, even just rules, fail on the floor of the House chamber. And so I wonder, even if they are able to get to 218, if Mike Johnson is still going to have a really difficult job trying to get some of these what could be big pieces of fiscal policy legislation over the finish line.
He absolutely is. I mean, let's not forget what we lived through last time. It means one person, two people. A Matt Gaetz who is upset at a speaker because of the ethics challenges he's facing and says, I'm going to blow up the House, right? It only takes one or two of them. So I still think that Mike Johnson, if he wins Speaker again, has the toughest job in Washington, D.C., trying to keep this caucus together because he has no room to maneuver.
So it's an easier job for Hakeem Jeffries then to play the insurgent role, is it not?
Possibly. I'm glad Jeannie brought up, though, the ousting of Speaker McCarthy is what she was alluding to. That was written into the conference rules. Any one member could bring forward a motion to vacate. If they keep the majority, Rick, they got to rewrite the rules, right? Or it's hard for Mike Johnson to continue to navigate this.
Yeah, I would say none of those rules apply any longer. Republican Party is a hierarchical party. The House is going to take their lead from Donald Trump, not from the Speaker. And Donald Trump, as we've seen, even out of office, was not bashful about telling the House of Representatives what to do. So we should not kid ourselves. There's going to be a lot of unity in the Republican caucus if we have the House, the Senate, and the presidency. And the calls will be made from the presidency, not from the leadership in either of those other two chambers. And I would be shocked if in the first 2 years of this administration, there are any real dissents within the Republican caucus in either one of those two chambers. Wow.
Back to the Democratic autopsy. Nancy Pelosi sat down with the New York Times and did a full interview about her impressions of what went wrong. Joe Biden didn't get out early enough, and she thought there would be a, quote, open primary, unquote, something that a lot of Democrats were calling for in that process. Is she right about both?
She is right about both of those things. I don't think those are the only factors. There's a lot of other factors, but certainly had he gotten out earlier, had there been an open primary, and had you allowed the voters to choose and not force them to be looking at a 78-year-old man and then his vice president, when he's incredibly unpopular, is hoisted on them because literally, as we talked about the other day, she became Hubert Humphrey of the Democratic Party, and nothing she did, but that's the reality. You can't win that way. So Nancy Pelosi is right about that, but there's other factors as well, including the fact that they cannot continue to try to operate as a party that is appealing to suburban, wealthy, educated people and talking about issues that are not about pocketbook. It's just not appealing.
People tend to forget that she was his vice president. That is what would happen when the president steps down, right? Should there have been some kind of shotgun primary to codify her status in the party?
Oh, I think that you could go all day long about all the great ideas that you coulda, shoulda, woulda done, including him not actually running for re-election. Well, that's right. Which was his original promise to the American people when he got elected the first time. So, look, none of that matters anymore, right? The Democratic Party has an identity problem. You know, they've been pursuing identity politics, you know, for the last 20 years, and it's been successful for them by and large. That ended really practically in 2016. They ignored it in 20. COVID, no question, you know, had some impact on the election then. Yeah. But as of, you know, Tuesday night, you know, there's a new majority party in town, and it's the Republican Party. And if the Democrats want to win, they have to do what Jeannie was just saying, which is find a way to communicate with a broader band of voters, because they have shrunk that party. It's not about the candidates, it's about the party. They don't have a message for the American people that is a majority message.
So can they do that work in 2 years, Jeannie? Because the next time they get a chance to try to change the balance of Congress is not 2028, it's 2026.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. It's going to be tough. You know, I think politically the best thing that could happen to the Democrats now is that they do not take the House. That they allow the Republicans to own, as Rick's talking about, what they're going to do in Washington, D.C., and then they become a loyal opposition. If they, in fact, narrowly get that House, then they can be used to say anything we didn't pass, well, that was the Democrats in the House. So that's, I think, not a great political strategy for them. And then they have to figure out how to appeal to an American public that is saying, stop demographically stereotyping me. If I am a woman or a Latino, it doesn't mean that I automatically only care about one narrow issue like abortion or immigration. I care about my life, my family, and the economy and my future and my jobs. You've got to talk to people where you find them.
All right, Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis, our signature political panel, thank you so much for joining us on this Friday and for this entire election week. Now, as Jeannie's talking about the economy, obviously the stock market is not the economy, but the stock market's doing pretty dang well. We're at another record high on the S&P 500, encroaching on the 6,000 level. And Bloomberg's markets correspondent, Abigail Doolittle, is tracking it for us. Abigail, what a way to end a week.
What a way to end a week, indeed. We're looking at the best week for the S&P 500 going all the way back to November of last year. So basically a year that S&P 500 up the better part of 5%. The Russell 2000, incredible, up 7%, the best week going all the way back to 2021, the highest level since that. But we also have that Dow higher and the NASDAQ higher. In fact, right now, as I speak, taking a look at this board, the Russell 2000 up more than 8%. So these big gains on the Trump trade, the certainty around who the next president of the United States is, Donald Trump, investors really liking that, his economic policy that they are assuming will be put in place, tax cuts, protectionism. It's interesting, though, there are some parts that have fallen away. But one way of looking at the Trump trade and one way to say that this week is not new is DJT, Trump Media and Entertainment. It is up more than 140% from the September lows. At that point, VP Harris led him in the predicted odds pretty significantly. But from that low, the stock higher, that was and is really still the market's way of voting for Donald Trump back then and saying that they thought he would be the next president of the United States. And it was a correct vote.
Trump trade still turning away from emerging markets, China stocks. Abigail, this continues.
It does continue. It's really interesting because the NASDAQ Golden Dragon Index, that HXC, it's down nearly 5% today. So really bucking the trend of the gains that we're seeing. Now, this is interesting because I read one headline saying that the reason that China stocks were down in the Asian session and also this index is lower has to do with the idea that the stimulus folks wanted out of China is not going to happen now, that President Xi of China is going to hold off for when President-elect Trump is in office to offset the possibility of the 60% tariffs. Do we know that there's 60% tariffs? No, that's the beginning of the negotiation, but it is certainly a strong stance. And it's interesting to see that maybe it's already shaping what's happening over in China.
Abigail, thank you so much. Abigail Doolittle, Bloomberg Markets correspondent, with us on Balance of Power as we connect the dots between this campaign and the markets. Fascinating headline, Kaylee, coming from Punchbowl here as we talk about the prospect for our relationship with China, the downturn in China stocks. This won't help. Jake Sherman at Punchbowl tweeting, top House Republicans are looking to strip China of its normal trade status with the U.S. That would be a massive development.
Yeah, it certainly would. According to Punchbowl's reporting, they would do this through legislation in the next term. And frankly, this is something we need to consider as to whether or not it could get through on a bipartisan basis, even if Republicans can't keep control of the House, knowing that being hawkish on China has bipartisan popularity in Washington. The China Select Committee, the ranking member of which is frequently on this program, is very much advocating for restraint in what they call, of course, a strategic competition. And this would be interesting to consider how tariff policy specifically would play into that. If you revoke the normal trade status, how does that counterplay with potentially 60% blanket tariffs
really
on everything coming out of this
It
country?
aligns with reporting from the Financial Times' Robert Lighthizer,
Yep.
who was USTR in the first term in the trade war with China, is coming back, assuming he takes that role in a Trump 2.0. We'll have a lot more ahead on Balance of Power. Live from New York, this is Bloomberg.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kaylee Lyons alongside Joe Matthew, broadcasting live from World Headquarters in New York for the last day this week. We'll be back in Washington next week. And you know who else is going to be back in Washington next week, Joe? Congress,
Lawmakers.
specifically the U.S. Senate, which has leadership elections that will start in earnest come next week.
We've got a specific focus on the leadership battle in the Senate because now we do know that it will be led by Republicans, Kaylee. There will be a vote next week. This is going to be one of the big stories that we are talking about in what is currently a three-way race to replace Mitch McConnell. And we're joined now by Bloomberg government Congress reporter Zach Cohen, who's got his eyes on this for us. He lives and breathes Capitol Hill, and there's a question, Zach, about whether the election of Donald Trump will effectively scramble that three-way race, bring in someone else like a Steve Daines. I know that there's been some reporting that he might not want to go in that direction, but when it comes down to the two Johns, Thune and Cornyn, add Rick Scott, how's this race shaping up?
Well, certainly Trump hasn't formally endorsed any candidates in this race. In fact, Senate Minority Whip John Thune, one of the frontrunners for this job, a Republican from South Dakota, has actually said a couple of times in the last couple of days that Trump should stay out of this contest, that it could actually backfire in a couple of ways if there are members of the Senate Republican Conference who say, I'm not a big fan of Trump weighing in on what is a secret ballot, very personal election. You have to remember that Senate Republicans are not just picking a majority leader, they're picking their top fundraiser, their chief tactician. Somebody's going to need to have their back on all the major legislative and political fights in the coming months and years. And so certainly Rick Scott, the Republican from Florida, who was just reelected on the same ballot as Trump, much closer to Trump than certainly Thune or Cornyn is, has been agitating for that endorsement for some time. He's told me he wants it and has been elevating endorsements from key Trumpian figures in hopes that that could sway a couple of senators to his side. But it has to be emphasized, this is a secret ballot election. This is not a speaker race. And so certainly there's less influence here than we've seen in the McCarthy or Mike Johnson fights.
Is there any potential really for a dark horse there then, Zach? Because obviously there's been a lot of buzz about Steve Daines, who's coming off a very successful cycle with not just the Senate majority attained, but more seats added than was understood to be likely. What role is he really going to play?
Yeah, Steve Daines, the Republican from Montana, who chaired the National Republican Senatorial Committee and I believe the top fundraiser for all Senate Republicans in the last 2 years in that position. And certainly Republicans coming in with probably 53 seats, assuming this call in Pennsylvania holds and the current leads for Democrats in Nevada and Arizona hold. 53 seats is certainly bigger than anything Democrats had during the Biden administration, and it gives them some leeway on things like the 2026 Senate races or on votes on really critical legislation going forward. Daines has said that he doesn't want to run for leader. There had been some speculation that Trump could push him into that race or that he could have a mandate basically for that job. But certainly I've seen some reporting that he is in favor of Thune instead for that role. And so someone could jump in at the last minute. Nothing is stopping them. There's no filing deadline. But Thune, Cornyn especially have been running for this job for months at this point. And a number of Republicans have already dedicated their support for one of those candidates or for Rick Scott. And so it's going to be harder for a dark horse to come in at this juncture.
Well, what does a post-McConnell world look like in the Senate? Are we going to see some deal making that kind of waters down the authority of the leader in the upper chamber, as some have suggested? We saw what Kevin McCarthy experienced making a deal like that.
Yeah, I mean, with some of that debate, some of that will be up for debate Tuesday night. Senate Republicans, basically as soon as they get back to Washington, are going to meet behind closed doors and talk with the candidates for leader about what changes, if any, that they would support that could potentially weaken the leadership position. There are certain proposals raised by Senator Mike Lee, a Republican from Utah. He chairs the steering committee, which is essentially a group of sort of hard right Republicans, similar to the Freedom Caucus in the House, that have been asking for things that would make it harder for the leader, for instance, to stop debate on a bill when they're fighting over amendments in order to move a must-pass vehicle forward, or maybe limiting the ability of the leader to name his allies to key committees after Lee and Scott lost their seats on the Commerce Committee when Scott ran against McConnell in 2022. And so the key question becomes, what concessions do people like Thune or Cornyn make to appease some of these folks who maybe on a second ballot, once Rick Scott doesn't have the support to go forward, assuming that is the case, where do those folks go, and what concessions do Thune and Cornyn make to try to get that support? Certainly, there's a broad interest in trying to limit the power of the leader. It's something McConnell is the longest-serving leader in American history of either Democrats or Republicans. And I think there's a lot of interest from committee chairs to rank and file to having more say in these legislative vehicles. And that's going to have a really critical impact on things like the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act renewal, the tax code overhaul from the Trump administration, on government funding, and all of that that's going to come up in the next 2 years.
All right, Bloomberg Government Congress reporter Zach Cohen, thank you so much. Now, as we consider Senator Mitch McConnell, who is about to see his long tenure in Senate leadership end, we, of course, heard from the man himself in the aftermath of the election results. Here is McConnell in his own words.
With regard to the Senate, you guys know how long I've been around. I had really hoped I'd be able to hand over to my successor the majority. I've been the majority leader. I've been the minority leader. Majority's a lot better.
Joining us now is someone who used to work for Senator McConnell. He's now principal and co-leader of Washington National Tax Services as PricewaterhouseCoopers. Rohit Kumar is back with us on Bloomberg TV and radio, having served as Deputy Chief of Staff and Domestic Policy Director for McConnell. Rohit, thanks so much for being with us. I would love just your reflection on the legacy McConnell is leaving here after 18 years serving in this leadership position. He said, "I was hoping I would be able to hand things over in the majority," and that's exactly what he's getting.
Yeah, I mean, he's getting what he wished would happen, which was a Senate Republican majority. But it'll be interesting because, as Zach referenced in the prior segment, one of the big fights that's coming ahead of Congress in 2025 is this expiration of all the 2017 individual and pass-through tax provisions. And Senator McConnell actually had a fair bit of experience in dealing with these expirations in 2010, then again in 2012, after they expired yet a second time. It was Senator McConnell and then Vice President Biden who negotiated, a resolution to those fiscal cliffs. And so this sort of next time around, you're going to have a whole new set of actors. No one that was there last time will be there this time. At least they won't be in the room. President Biden will no longer be president. Senator McConnell will still be in the Senate and could be a sort of a sounding board, much in the way that former Speaker Pelosi has stayed in the House and I think served as a resource to Minority Leader Jeffries. But he won't be the one, presumably, in the room in the final negotiations, because that's the role for the new leader, whoever that ends up being.
So what's your thought on the leadership battle here? Will it be one of the three that we have been mentioning, Thune, Cornyn, Scott? Could that pool expand because of the election of Donald Trump? And no matter who gets this job, what will it mean for the culture of the upper chamber?
Yeah, so, I mean, it's always possible that someone else throws their hat into the ring, but it would be extraordinarily difficult for someone to do so at this stage in the equation. The vote is scheduled to happen next week. The three candidates that are running have been running for the bulk of the year, ever since Senator McConnell announced that he was not going to stand for leader again. And as Zach indicated in the prior segment, it's a secret ballot vote. So even if someone were to throw their hat in the ring, and even if they were to secure the endorsement of the president-elect, it's not a speaker vote. It's not done in public. You can promise that you're going to vote for whoever you think you need to promise you're going to vote for. But then at the, in the end of the day, you get to cast your vote wherever you choose to. And I think that was part of the Senator Thune's sort of the rationale for his argument for why endorsements are not wise here, because you just never know if it's going to be outcome determinative, and you risk alienating. If your preferred candidate doesn't prevail, then you risk alienating whoever does prevail.
Well, of course, while this leadership election is going to get started next week, the new majority won't actually be seated with that new leader in place until January, when they'll have to start working on the very ambitious agenda outlined by President-elect Donald Trump. It's something, Rohit, that we spoke about with Senator Bill Hagerty of Tennessee last night on Balance of Power. This is what he told us, and we'll have you respond.
President Trump's overarching goal is to see a lot more economic growth here in this economy. You can count on another effort to undertake a massive deregulation thrust. By some measures, the cost of deregulation under the Biden administration has been more than $1 trillion. It's a compliance burden that is enormous. That's something that can be lifted on our businesses. It will have an impact in a positive way on the economy, and that can be undertaken without any cost.
And I wonder, Rohit, as we consider the costs here, just the way in which even deregulation, how quickly it would move through this incoming administration and Congress. Help us set realistic expectations here, if you would.
Yeah, so deregulation can happen sort of one of two ways. One's more sort of quicker than the other. To the extent that there are pending regulations that have not yet been finalized, then on day one of the new administration, and you would see this typically in a new administration, you get sort of a pencils down order across the board. Whatever you're working on, stop. Let us take a moment, evaluate where things stand, if we want to pursue this regulation, or if we want to go a different direction, or we don't want to do it. In some cases, maybe we don't want to do this at all. We don't think there's any version of this that's a good idea. So that's not a lifting of a current burden, but to the extent that there's a proposed regulation out there, and the private sector was preparing to comply with some version of that regulation and altering its behavior in anticipation of that rule being finalized, that has sort of an immediate effect on behavior. The other is if there is a regulation that's already been finalized, and if it was finalized long enough ago that it's not subject to congressional review, then the way to undo it is, frankly, you have to issue a new regulation, which means you have to go, propose a new rule, go through a notice and comment period, and that can take, several months, maybe even up to a year or longer, depending on the complexity of the rule, how quickly you get a new proposal out, how many comments you get, things like that. And then for rules that were finalized within 60 legislative days, and legislative days is an important concept here, within 60 legislative days of the end of the session, those rules in theory are eligible for review by the new Congress using sort of what's called the Congressional Review Act, which is a statute that dates back to the mid-90s. Was used probably most expansively in the first Trump administration, again, coming off a Democratic administration with a bunch of rules that Republicans were not fans of. And I think they overturned 16 rules using the Congressional Review Act in the early part of 2017. So you would anticipate some of the more recent rules, the ones that were finalized, in the latter half of 2024, perhaps being eligible for deregulatory move, but by an act of Congress. It does require the president to sign the disapproval resolution into law, which is why it would not have been effective if, President Biden had been reelected or if Vice President Harris had become President Harris. But in a change in administration, it opens up the aperture for that form of deregulatory movement as well.
Right. You mentioned the Trump-era tax cuts. Our audience should know you helped to lead PwC's National Tax Office. And as we focus our conversation here on the Senate, if the House does turn Democratic, I realize the odds are better for a Republican-led House. What would it mean for the effort to extend or make permanent the tax cuts?
So, clearly it would be a different negotiation if it's divided government. Yeah. And my anticipation is that negotiation drags into the wee hours of 2025, somewhere between Thanksgiving and the end of the calendar year is when that negotiation probably takes off in earnest, not unlike the 2012 fiscal cliff negotiations, which took off really in earnestness, like the week of Christmas going into the new year. And in that scenario, you would anticipate some pressure on the headline corporate rate, and you would expect some pressure on the top marginal rate, returning from 37 to 39.6, and perhaps a debate about at what income level that upper bracket, that higher upper top bracket would kick in. And then in addition to that, you would anticipate House Democrats to continue to pursue their preferred version of the child tax credit, a pretty dramatic expansion of the child tax credit, if not the 2021 version in the American Rescue Plan, but something approaching that. But, it'll be interesting to see House Democrats would have to just sort of figure out what to prioritize. Is it prioritizing raising taxes on corporations and upper income individuals? Is it, prioritizing tax relief for lower and middle income families? With some leverage, but not, without the Senate, without the White House, you don't have an unlimited amount of leverage. So it'll be interesting to see what do House Democrats choose if they were to find themselves in the majority. What would they prioritize in a negotiation, and what would they, say? Look, if we had total control, we would do these things, but with only the House, we have to focus our political capital on the places where it matters most.
We're out of time, but is John Thune in the lead to replace Mitch McConnell?
That is the conventional wisdom, but these are notoriously tricky things to predict because it is a secret ballot. And I think it was Senator Lamar Alexander, who's no longer in the Senate, said at one point he wrote, something like 25 thank you notes for 24 votes. So it does happen sometimes that people say they're going to do something, but in the the secret ballot they do something perhaps else.
Let's compare notes once we know. Rohit Kumar, co-leader of PwC's National Tax Office. Thank you so much for being with us here on the Friday edition of Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kari Lake. We learned a couple things since the start of this program.
Yeah, and of course we have more coming up later today. We'll be back for the late edition of Balance of Power at 5 p.m. Eastern Time as we close out our election week here live in New York City. And Bloomberg Business Week is straight ahead after this, right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.